All right. Can you hear me? This is Ward.
Hi,
Is that Ward? I couldn't tell. Your voice is not distinct at all.
Not distinct at all.
Well, maybe I can do Lucas's voice.
I don't understand.
No. This is Lucas. Pro tip.
Pro tip.
Yeah. La, 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 la.
This episode is sponsored by Hired.com. Every week on Hired, they run an auction where over 1,000 tech companies in San Francisco, New York, and LA bid on JavaScript developers, providing them with the salary and equity up front. The average JavaScript developer gets an average of 5 to 15 introductory offers and an average salary of over $130,000 a year. Users can either accept an offer and go right into interviewing with the company or deny them without any continuing obligations. It's totally free for users, and when you're hired, they also give you a $2,000 signing bonus as a thank you for using them. But if you use the Adventures in Angular link, you'll get a $4,000 bonus instead. Finally, if you're not looking for a job but know someone who is, you can refer them to Hired and get a $1,337 bonus if they accept a job. Go sign up at hired.com/adventuresinangular. Does your team need to master AngularJS? Oasis Digital offers Angular Bootcamp, a 3-day, in-person workshop class for individuals or teams. Bring us to your site or send developers to ours, angularbootcamp.com. This episode is sponsored by Wijmo5, a brand new generation of JavaScript controls. A pretty amazing line of HTML5 and JavaScript products for enterprise application development in that Wijmo5 leverages ECMAScript 5, and each control ships with AngularJS directives. Check out the faster, lighter, and more mobile Wijmo 5. This episode is sponsored by DigitalOcean. DigitalOcean is the provider I use to host all of my creations. All the shows are hosted there, along with any other projects I come up with. Their user interface is simple and easy to use, their support is excellent, and their VPSs are backed on solid-state drives and are fast and responsive. Check them out at DigitalOcean.com. If you use the code AngularAdventures, you'll get a $10 credit.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 47 of Adventures in Angular. On our panel today, we have Lucas Rubuki,
Yo.
Ward Bell,
Hello there.
and I'm Joe Eames. I'm your host. And we have a special guest today, Patrick Stapleton.
Hey guys.
So, Patrick, the topic today is going to be like kind of a general Angular 2, migrating to Angular 2, etc. But before we get into that, it would be a good idea to talk a little bit about yourself and your background and just kind of give us an introduction to who you are.
Yeah, so I'm Patrick Stapleton, but I'm also known as Patrick JS, and that's because my middle name is John and my last name is Stapleton. So it actually is JS.
Wow, that's the coolest name ever.
Yeah.
Man, why can't I be Joe JS?
Yeah, so that's my thing. I do corporate training in open source at a small company my friend and I started called Angular Class. I also work with the Angular team on server rendering, Angular 2, and Falcor.js with Netflix on Angular 2 integration and examples for that. And I guess my background is more of previously I was also the CTO at a small startup in San Francisco called Keychain Logistics, Adrian Horowitz-backed, YC-backed company. Before that, I was also an instructor and an alum of Hack Reactor, which is a 12-week bootcamp. And during that, I also won a launch hackathon and also created this thing called Reddit Insight, which is downloading Reddit and then running some analytics on top of it. And that was actually extremely popular and was actually the top 50,000 websites viewed that day. That's me. I've been doing Angular for about 2 years now.
I've seen your picture, and I don't, you're too young to be a CTO. I'm just saying.
Well, that's kind of a long story. It's more of an opportunity I took. But yeah, that's a whole other story.
Or you can just dye your beard gray. That'll help.
Well, my hair is turning gray.
Oh, that's stress.
Yeah.
What do you think about Angular 2 and where it is headed?
So Angular 2 is really, really interesting because it's more enterprise grade. You can think of frameworks in the spectrum of far left being really good for small apps and far right being really good for enterprise. Then Angular 2 is more so on the right, and Angular 1 is more so on the left. And this is why Angular 2 is getting a lot of flack with examples, because it's usually a lot of boilerplate because it's literally in alpha right now and it's not done yet. While in Angular 1, it's built for a lot smaller apps. And because of that, the examples are just way more simpler, and it's in production already, so it's not like it's in alpha or anything.
I'm curious about that enterprise small app distinction, particularly since I spend a lot of time in the so-called enterprise, and they have a lot of small apps. So, mostly small apps. Actually, if anybody's smaller than we used to think of enterprise as really big, but it's actually the Facebooks and all the social media things that are really big and making enterprise small. So, but that's a roundabout way of asking, what the heck are you focusing on that is the enterprisey character that is missing in Angular as we know it today?
I would say TypeScript static analysis, more so static analysis. Like Angular 2's focus is having a really solid baseline, being able to statically analyze your code base, and from there you can even turn your application into an abstract syntax tree. And then you can even like go really crazy there. Like some people do that in enterprise. But the idea of Angular 2 right now is that they're trying to get the foundation extremely solid, so that way when you build abstractions on top of it, and it's a lot easier to reason about for tooling because you have that static analysis. So I guess when I say enterprise, it's more of working with large teams and being able to work more independent because you have better tooling. And a lot of problems that you run into with Angular 1, and that is like typos with the directives and everything, will essentially go away because you could create a schema for a directive, or you have types, and then you're able to infer what the directive needs in order to interact with it, etc. So I guess like when I say enterprise, that's kind of what I'm trying to get at.
Okay, I one can debate whether that's enterprise or not, but I get where you're going there. There's the thought that you're going to have large applications with large teams, and that they'll have more success if they have better tooling and they have the kind of type support that you get out of a TypeScript, so that they can get some design time feedback rather than relying on runtime failures, and so they can write even fewer tests than they write today, so that they don't have to know whether they're actually working or not because the compiler will tell them, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, so I'd like to turn the discussion a little bit into like Angular 2 kind of preparation and migration, getting ready for Angular 2 and maybe migrating your apps from Angular 1 to Angular 2. I think we could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the minimum amount of effort that you could put in right now is just switching to ES6. Like that alone will do wonders for you during the migration, because majority of the changes is just due to the language itself. And if you want to take another step further, you could then start abstracting your services into classes. And I have a GitHub gist showing an example of an Angular 1 service and an Angular 2 service, a simple to-do app, where it's using both the Angular 1 DI in one file and Angular 2 DI in the other one. And that's literally the only difference between the two, is the dependency injection. And if you look at the files, I'm going to post in the show notes or whatever, but like if you look at the file, literally the only thing that's different is the top and the bottom part of the file, where the class itself is relatively the same.
It's very interesting.
So that's actually like a really big thing to do, to say just use ES6. There's a ton of decisions that have to be made there. Like, should we use TypeScript or Babel, or what do you mean by ES6? Because you mean something besides JavaScript native, like some sort of transpiler has to happen. So what are you suggesting?
Yeah, so in any production app, you're always going to have a build system. You're always going to minify your code, right? Mm-hmm. So while you're doing that, you might as well also add another step, and that's using something like ES6, Babel, or TypeScript. So to make the transition easier, I would recommend Babel. But if you're willing to learn a little bit more about types, then I would definitely recommend TypeScript.
So once we're on Angular 2, are you recommending we use Babel on Angular 2, or are you recommending we use TypeScript on Angular 2?
You could use Babel in Angular 2, but I highly recommend you use TypeScript, just because you have the type dependency injection. So you could essentially specify, you have this small sugar where you specify the type, and then when you compile it down, TypeScript will automatically add a decorator to inject the type for you, or to inject that service for you.
So a lot of us are going to be able to do one conversion to Babel and then one conversion to TypeScript. So So you're saying it's easier to go from nothing to Babel, but ideally we should go to TypeScript. It's kind of what I'm hearing.
Well, just going to anything like ES6, plus there, like ES6, I guess the only options are really just at this moment just Babel and TypeScript. Anyone would help. But so I guess I should say like converting an application from Babel to TypeScript is literally just adding types to the constructor. And that's the minimum amount that you need to add to convert it from Babel to TypeScript. Like you don't technically need to, because it's optional types, you don't technically need to add types to every single thing.
Mm-hmm.
So, Aaron, you're a huge proponent of ES6, right?
Yeah.
You've done a lot of work with it. What do you guys think of the authoring scenario in ES5? I mean, I'm sure you've seen the examples of Angular 2 and ES5. What's your thoughts on that versus, so somebody that says, oh, I don't want to go to ES6 and the Angular team's promised that I can write in ES5. Maybe some thoughts about that.
At NG Vegas, Brian showed if someone wanted to use ES5, I don't care. Like, there's tools though that will help you. So like at NG Vegas, they showed this tool, I think it's called AiA.js, but it gets you kind of the same kind of syntax that annotations give you, but you can use it in, like it's similar, the setup is similar to what you're doing in ECMAScript 6 with annotations, but it's all wrapped inside this A library. You get some magic out of it so that people who are in ES5 and if they have some reason why they need to stay there, they can stay there. So if you need to stay in ES5, there's tools for you. That's my opinion. Hopefully, though, everyone is saying, yeah, we'll use ES6. I know that there are like the Eric Elliott's who hate anything to do with classes, and so they're like going to avoid that, at least that one part of ES6, which is unfortunately what Angular 2 is heavily dependent on. So
isn't Ward in that camp?
I am one of the people who is fearful that classes will be overused. Particular worry is deep inheritance. So it isn't that I mind a single level of class, but what I see going on, in the statically typed world, is that people then are using inheritance over composition, and they're getting these deep inheritance trees, and you get lost. And that's bad in the static world, and it's not so good here. And of course, you can do just fine with function style JavaScript in both TypeScript and this new world. What I don't know is it does seem that Angular 2 is resistant to that. Is that a correct impression? It's resistant to our couching services as functions as opposed to as classes.
Well, remember that Angular 2 is built from the ground up with emphasis on performance. So also remember that in the browser, the V8, for example, the engine that runs the browser, it actually looks for the class pattern and optimizes for that. So deep down internally, it's actually creating a class object in C++ or whatever, and it's optimizing down there. So that's why like classes are here to stay, just because of that performance gain. Example would be Dart. When they were doing the Dart and making a VM for that, they found that they were able to get twice the amount of speed compared to V8 because everything's statically typed and everything's using a classical system, and they're able to replicate a lot of that in the virtual machine. But more of on your question, Angular has always been advocating composition over inheritance, and the best example of this is directives. So in Angular, you have this notion of directives, right? And Polymer, you have this notion of web components, right? Now, in Polymer, they favor inheritance, and because of that, you have to inherit like their Polymer class, and then you're able to extend on top of it. In Angular, you just create a component, and then you add a whole bunch of directives inside of that. So now the pros and cons of the two, so with Angular, that's a composition, because you add multiple ones around each other rather than inheriting it. In Angular 2 and 1, you run into a problem of having to prefix all your directives, rather than in Polymer, where you don't have to prefix like your directives, because you know for a fact like this is being like what properties are being what, as opposed to Angular 2, where you actually need to prefix your properties, because then you don't know which directive is like what you're setting for which directive. So that's like an interesting problem of the two paradigms. But Angular 2 is focusing more on that. Trying to not get too deep into insane inheritance.
Boy, that's a bookmark thing. I got to go figure out what the heck where you were just going with that, but I think I get it. And I think my worry about the class thing is insane inheritance and what in the way that's going to get people going down that route. But it's not necessary that they fall down that trapdoor any more than it's necessary that they fall down it in statically typed languages. So it's just a worry because, as you say, as you started here, you talked about how there was this orientation to the enterprise. And to my mind, that what we're sort of doing is trying to make it easy on developers who have spent all their time in statically typed languages to try and bring over their habits to the JavaScript world, which means not being true to the opportunities, not taking advantage of the opportunities and the style that's available in JavaScript. And that's worrisome. But we can get over it.
Yeah, so you're definitely right. That's always been the case with Angular. It's always been the case that it's always trying to make it easier for more people from other languages. Example would be just Angular 1 itself with the notion of like factory from Java and just a lot of stuff, patterns from Java that makes it a lot easier for people coming from enterprises and other languages. But that's the whole purpose of TypeScript in general anyways. But you're right, like it's inevitable, like it's going to happen. The only way to prevent it is for all the influencers to advocate against it. So when people are learning Angular, they learn from whatever resources are out there. And if everyone keeps talking about, you should do this because of this, then they'll know not to do that. Like I know exactly what you're talking about because when I was doing corporate training for this one company, there's this one particular person that, because we were teaching it in Babel, he kept using classes for everything. And then I was saying, like, you could do that, but then look what happens. Like now you have to manage your dependencies rather than having the DI manage it for you, because he was creating all these classes and then returning them from factories and everything. And I was showing him, like, you could do that. It's just that you only want to do that for certain reasons, etc.
I'm completely with you. We're gonna have to help the community that as it comes over here gain the benefits of the strong typing and the design time checking, but shed their typical knee-jerk behaviors, and we can do it. It's just a challenge.
So my thought is that Ward's fear is good fear, and I hope people heed what he's saying. I do think, however, the new class system doesn't add any functionality to classes, to inheritance that we don't already have in JavaScript. So I don't really run into an insane amount of over hierarchical inheritance chaining with prototypes. And I know that classes make it easier, so it's going to bound more with classes than it would be with the prototypical inheritance. But because it's never been like prolific with prototypes, I'm not sure it's going to be prolific with classes either. Like I think you'll get some inheritance, but I don't think you're going to have like these things we're all scared of, which are these never-ending trees of inheritance, and you can never find where the function that you inherited came from. Like I don't think we're going to really see that. And if you do, I mean, just fix it. Like I don't think it's going to be a thing. And anyone who does, if it's on like some major framework, like if Angular does it or React does it, it'll quickly become a dinosaur because people aren't going to migrate to something like that.
Well, I certainly hope you're right, and I'm also hopeful that we will be continuing what I consider a fruitful pattern within JavaScript, which is duck typing. Where you just you layer on functionality, borrowing from different things, and if it looks like a duck and acts like a duck, it's a duck. So, Patrick, what kinds of things change for the Angular developer the Angular 1 developer who wants to sort of shape his code, be ready to move? Where are the things that you concentrate? I know I've seen some of your videos, and you've been working on trying to get that thought across.
Yeah, so the biggest thing is services, just because they could be refactored into just classes. In Angular 1, you do the module revealer pattern, and that's essentially just return an object, and then that has the methods. And then you can refactor that into a class very simply. The other place is directives, and this is another thing that people don't realize, but essentially, even though the API is really scary at times, like essentially there's no like best practice or opinion on how you should create a directive, and because of that, they kind of give you just all the options in the world. So in my NG Vegas example, like I show that you could actually use the exact same syntax in Angular 1 and 2 for binding data, So in Angular 1, you would do this with scope, and then an object, and then you would say data. On the right-hand side, you would actually rename data to equals data or equals bind data. So that way, in the template, it looks like bind dash data. And this is a semantic in Angular 2 where you're able to create an alternative syntax rather than the whole bracket shorthand to actually specify what you're binding. And we could take advantage of that convention in Angular 2 and take it and bring it over to Angular 1. And doing that would also make the interface in Angular 1 a lot simpler too, because it's best practices already.
That was a really cool demonstration, which it comes about halfway through that video. I know we're going to have the link, but you did a number of moves there where you were sort of showing the symmetry, almost the syntactic symmetry between what you would write in Angular 2 and what you would write in Angular 1. I thought that was really good. One of the other interesting things you did in there is you replaced, in the directive, you replaced a link function with a controller. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so it was kind of like a bad practice previously. And so I'm talking like in Angular. So Angular 1 it's very old. It's 5 years. And I kind of seen the community kind of change its opinion. And it's like, it was actually really wonderful because this is a little bit tangent, but essentially like the best thing about Angular is also one of the worst things. That's always been the case. So one of the best things is that it doesn't hold that much of an opinion on you. And because of that, you're able to be a lot more flexible. And that's how we got the whole like module, like folder structure, as opposed to just controller type system that kind of just got crazy after a while. And that's because we don't have that restriction. And because of that, like the community just changes overall. So previously the controller it was actually bad practice to do any DOM manipulation in there, etc. But because we now know what best practices are for components, it does make sense now to do that. And the difference between a controller and a link is that the link function, you have more control over the life cycle of your component as opposed to a controller where it just gets invoked before all the link to post-link, pre-link thing happens. That's also one of the downsides of Directive API in Angular 1 is that it wasn't really thought up, like the lifecycle system wasn't really thought up that it needed to be user-friendly. It's more of an afterthought just because there was a use case. This happens because of the whole like progression of time. And also remember that another example is the router. So the first router, the one made by Angular, it was actually only using one view. And that was actually by design because initially Angular was advocating people to use more directives. And that's what people are doing now. But the problem back then is that everyone was scared of the Directive API because it's really scary. I mean, we have like talks about that. We have a book about it, etc. for good reason. And because of that, the community kind of like shifted to UI router, which makes sense. And that's great. And then just went full on just MVC. And because of that, everyone just kind of the community shifted the best practices to that. And then when someone else came around and said, hey, we should do everything like components, suddenly everyone's saying, oh, that's a good idea. We should be doing that. But the problem was that like the Angular team was kind of advocating that initially. It's just that there was no like best practices or good API because of that.
Right, and the directive syntax was meant to support a great many edge cases that maybe weren't the best idea, but they had that really complicated pipeline of when this happened and that happened. It's just kind of crazy, isn't it?
Yeah,
and they've been able to boil that away, a lot of that away in NG2, right? There aren't as many moments to worry about. Is that a fair statement?
Well, they're still doing Angular 2, and that is allowing you to have full control over your components. And it's actually really nice because if you want to do something really advanced, then you could do that. But if you don't, then you don't have to, if that makes sense.
Right. I mean, you're not bombarded with, okay, there's a compile. I have to decide whether I'm going to have a compile or not. And if I have a link, do I have a pre-link and a post-link and, all of that crazy edge stuff.
Yeah, so it's more thought out because of the experience of everyone in the community and learning what the best practices are now. And another caveat with components in general is that everyone keeps talking about this MV, VM, MVC, MV, whatever. What it really is just MVC within MVC. And that's the thing that people kind of forget. And that's another thing that happens all the time. Everyone kind of forgets history and they're doomed to repeat it. For example, the server is MVC, but then you create a single page app and that's one part of your MVC app. And then on the front end, your MVC app, and then each component is MVC. And that's essentially how apps are structured. But people kind of forget that. That's a whole other tangent as well.
Well, I think I know what you mean there. Let me throw it back at you. Do you mean that the UI is composed, the unit of composition are these little MVC triads, if you will, and they are nested, and you build up your app through a sort of a nesting of these things through composition. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the idea is that for us as humans, it's easier to reason about a problem if it's smaller and if it's encapsulated. That's why like something like the module or component system was great, because it's basically a small app, right? And it's easier to reason about that. And if we have multiple small apps, it's easier to reason about that. And that's why it's composable and MVC is just all recursive, because it's just easier to reason about for us.
Yeah, it's just that sometimes it's scary. I mean, recursion is scary for people, and things inside of things is scary for people. But I think I know what you mean. And you sort of build up semantic units that represent, what you're trying to accomplish, and then you build out of these Lego parts. You're building your Lego parts, and then building new Legos out of the Lego parts, and so forth. It's that kind of idea, right?
Yeah, and the difference between, like, say, like a module folder structure and a component folder structure is that the component folder structure enforces restrictions on you that leads you down a better path in terms of avoiding anti-patterns. And that's why it's kind of a best practice now to do that, just because of that. Because the difference between the two is not much at all.
So what's an anti-pattern that you would be steered around?
Okay, so I guess this is a good segue to data binding, or two-way data binding. So one of the biggest problems with Angular 1 developers today is that a lot of times when people make the initial version of this page, they don't refactor it. And I say refactor as in, if you make a large function, you usually refactor into smaller functions, so it's easier for you to reason about. The best example is a wizard or a form. You would make your form, maybe it's dynamic, you have ng repeat in there, and you have multiple fields. A lot of people would use the primitives given to you by Angular, ng-click, etc. But no one actually refactors into components. So that way it's easier to reason about, and you're able to have more control over the performance and logic. And this is something that in any other framework, like Backbone, for example, you would actually write everything manually. And because you're writing everything manually, you're more cognitive of the performance implications of everything, as opposed to in Angular where you have so much power over everything, you're kind of drunk with it because you're constantly just using all the directives in the world. And this is essentially Scott Moss's talk about having to, well, his is also about performance and everyone using too much like ng everything. What I'm trying to get at is that like you should refactor your behavior into a component so you could better optimize for it. And that's something that kind of becomes apparent when you are forced into this component architecture, because you're kind of like forced to think of everything as a way to turn it into a component. And because of that, you're kind of falling into the pit of success there.
I've got this image in my mind of Lucas wringing his hands and laughing demonically as he codes up his Angular 1 apps, and then being stripped of his power when Angular 2 comes around and like withering away and dying. The bucket of water thrown on him.
Well, Angular 2, we do have ng model back in Angular 2. So that's the most loved feature in Angular 1.
Hey, that's a great segue. Let's talk about that. Go.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, I talked a lot, so I wanted to like balance it out. I don't know.
Now let's talk. ng model.
Yeah, ng model, and
we didn't have it.
And you were talking about two-way data binding and anti-patterns, and you definitely had my attention, since I think of two-way data binding as a pro pattern.
Yes. So I was kind of purposely segueing into this. So essentially, the reason why we want two-way data binding is for forms, and that's because when we all went to Angular World, we all found out that dealing with forms is actually kind of amazing. And that's because it's a lot easier to reason about inputs with two-way data binding. And the anti-pattern with two-way data binding is that it's harder to separate concerns when dealing with data, because essentially that model is updating the UI. And this is more of I guess, answering the previous question of the reason why ng model is great is because of that whole MVC architecture. When you're making an ng model on ng form, so like a lot of people, so I need to do some backstory, but essentially, whenever I teach Angular, like no one, and whenever I ask like Angular developers, no one really knows about the form controller or the ng model controller. Essentially, when you create a form, you're creating a controller, and whenever you create a ng model, it's essentially creating a controller there and it's attaching it to it. So essentially, you have this system where you have smaller components interacting with a larger component, like a group. And if you were to think of this imperatively, which is something you could do in Angular 2 now, you could think of it as you have a service that interacts with many functions. So in Angular 1 and Angular 2, the template, this is a whole other tangent as well, but essentially like there's two tracks to two forms. That's template-driven and data-driven. Template-driven is markup directives and components. Data-driven is JavaScript functions and services. But essentially, with two-way data binding, because you have this miniature like MVC model going on in your forms, the two-way data binding is creating the coupling for you, which is great, and it allows you to interact with your data that way. And the only reason, so this is another tangent, but essentially it's an anti-pattern because two-way data binding and other parts of your app is actually can allow you to shoot yourself in the foot. But essentially, that's why it's great for forms, if that kind of makes sense.
Maybe we can make it more concrete with an example. I mean, let's suppose you had a lot of people and they have a first name and a last name, and you want to construct a full name. You have a sort of computed full name property, right? So when I'm in a form and I'm updating a person, that's when the two-way data binding kind of comes to the fore. And I expect, for example, as I change the first name from Fred to Sam, that the computed full name is updated for me dynamically as I go, because the value of changing the first name goes into the object. The computed property gets calculated, and by virtue of dirty checking, the computed property appears as I type, right? So that's the classic example of how you might wrap, a concrete thing like person into a form. But now I've got this long list of all the people that I know, the million people that are my best friends, and that's outside of the form. And so, I don't know, just take that as an example and then try and make the points that you were just making.
Yeah, so in Angular 2, you're able to take advantage of actual computed properties. So Angular 2 is kind of like pushing most of the work into the language. So that's just another example of that. But essentially, what you're running into is a data management problem. And that is essentially like just a hard problem in general. Because if you're dealing with a form, say you have a long list and you say you have all these computed properties and everywhere, essentially you want to update that view model. Then only when it's validated and it's ready, you want to update the actual model in your service or whatever, just because you don't want to have any like side effects happen.
But I do want a side effect. If I change the first name, I want the full name to change. And there's nothing really complicated about this at all. I mean, this is one of the great things about Angular is I didn't have to think about it. I had a person, it has a first name and a last name, it has one computed property, full name. Every time I change the first name or the last name, the full name is refreshed. Nope.
Just so long as you didn't go 11 levels deep on that.
But I don't. I mean, realistically,
you really don't.
I mean, this is like falling off a log. As a matter of fact, it was the first example that if you ever walked into Angular and you looked and they taught you something, this was practically the first example, and you said, yeah, give me some of that. That's one of the things I've loved about Angular. That's why I came to Angular. So if it's not that simple, then I feel like something's taken away from me. And if somebody tells me that it was always so complicated, I look at them and I say, what are you talking about? That wasn't complicated. So what anti-pattern here? Where's the anti-pattern? So I'm trying to figure out why. I'm hoping you can shed some light.
So
where's the anti-pattern here?
So you have two-way data binding. I should just clear that out. You have that now with ng-model, and you're able to do what you want to do. I'm only suggesting that for a lot of other people, like it's a lot easier for them to shoot themselves in the foot because, for example, a good practice for creating a form is not to update the model directly, because what if the user backs out, or what if the user disconnects, or if they're offline, etc. Then you have this stale data laying around. And if you update it automatically, you also have like a multiple user concurrent problem as well.
That's not solved by any change to data binding at all. The full name is a display property. If I'm changing Fred and then the thing goes south, or somebody on the, some other user somewhere else changed it to Rebecca, I got that problem without regard to what data binding system I have.
So I'm saying, like, you still have that. It's just in the language as a computed property. Like, that's like a language feature now.
Well, we're going to have to duke this out sometime.
I think we're going to need to have a whole episode just about Angular 2 forms.
Because I don't know about you guys, but I am freaking out by all this talk about how hard life has been for us and all the troubles and the precipices and abyss we've been falling into. And like I'm sitting here, I'm just saying, man, I've been cranking out some pretty mean apps. And suddenly they're telling me I'm doing it. I've been doing it wrong all this time. And instead I got to stand on my head to scratch my ear. I don't get it. But there you go. That's another talk.
Yeah, essentially it's the whole like model system going to component system. There's no difference. It's more of just for beginners, it's a lot easier for them not to shoot themselves in the foot. So I guess shooting to more like directly address it is if you could change the model on the template itself. So that's if you changing the model. Oh, well, that's data binding. Essentially, like, it's just more of like dealing with stale data that people shoot themselves in the foot with.
All right, so we are going to wrap up on that note, but I could tell that this is definitely one of those topics we're going to have to...
Yeah, we're not going to agree on this anytime soon. I was lost until, and so I was with Ward.
This is a very interesting thing, and this is cool because I think we're representing a lot of people here in this conversation. So something we'll have to bring up in another episode. I'm sure Ward. This is one of Ward's hot buttons, so we can't even mention Angular 2 without this topic coming up, right, Ward?
Yeah, I've got a song in my head about that. It's like an old soul song. If loving you is wrong, I don't want to be right. I mean,
that's awesome.
That's it, man. If shooting myself in the foot, I'm gonna keep shooting. I'm gonna lose that foot.
All right. Well, we gotta wrap this up. So we're gonna move on to picks. Let's have Aaron. Do you want to go first with your pick?
Yeah. So anyone who knows me will know that the book Ready Player One was basically my favorite book I've ever read. Pick it up and read it. It's an awesome book. It's my favorite book I've ever read. I probably read it several times in the last few years. The author is releasing another book that will be a movie as well. It's called Armada, and it comes out next month in July. But this week he released on a blog that I will put in the show notes Chapter 1 of his new book, Armada. And from the very first sentence, he sucks you in. And it's a little Last Starfighter-ish. But I think you'll see why this guy got such a good name. So yeah, go check out this Chapter 1 of Armada and get excited to get the book next month.
Just FYI, I've already pre-ordered that bad boy.
Yeah, Will Wheaton's narrating. I pre-ordered it as well, so I'll have it down.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. Anyway, that's my pick.
Okay. Awesome.
Oh, can I do one more pick?
Oh,
one more pick?
Yeah, go, bro. Go.
I'm excited about the Mind Hive, the collection of awesome Angular people that are going to be out in Boston later this year at Angular Summit. So I wanted to just kind of throw it out there. Hey, everyone, if you're East Coasty and you want to get some Angular love, go check out Angular Summit, angularsummit.com, and maybe submit a proposal to speak as well as get a ticket. So, yeah, that's my other pick.
Sweet. Katya, you're up.
Okay, my pick for this week is sign language, because I was learning that in school, and it's such a cool, just kind of like it's a cool language because you can communicate underwater and over really, really big distances, and it's just really cool. Just really like sign language.
Oh, great, Katya! Another way that two teens can talk to each other, and I won't understand them.
Exactly.
That's why they made sign language, Ward.
Yeah. That's totally why.
I knew it. And they're talking about me, too, while they're doing it.
Oh, you know. You know it.
All right. Ward, you're up.
Well, first of all, if loving you is wrong, I don't want to be right. I got the link in there. You got to have it. Secondly, there is still time for you to attend Angular U in San Francisco. It's coming up June 22nd. All kinds of Angular team folks are going to be there. I'm going to be there. Joe's going to be there. Lots of good people going to be there. So head on out to San Francisco and check it out. And then I picked up a book in the airport. I was flying back from Sweden. And it's by a Nobel Prize winner named Daniel Kahneman called Thinking Fast and Slow. And Katya, you got to read this thing. It's so fascinating about the way in which it talks about how we reflexively behave in ways that we're unaware of, and think quickly to wrong conclusions. And then how another part of our mind, which is the one we think is us, is occasionally engaged to correct those instinctive reactions and try and come out with reasoned answers. And there's this sort of tension going on between these two parts of ourselves. And the book is fascinating, and it was the basis of his Nobel Prize in economics. So, but it's very readable. So check it out. Thinking Fast and Slow.
I know what I'm going to read on the plane to Russia.
Awesome. All right, I'll go, and then we always like to have our guests go last, so you'll be after me, Patrick.
Cool.
So for my pick, I'm going to pick Denmark. I just took a trip to Denmark for a week, had an awesome time. It was great. Went and spoke at a conference. Denmark. Even went over to Sweden. I had no idea that if you're in Denmark and you want to go to Sweden, you just hop on the train. No passports, no nothing. It was super cool. So got to go over to Sweden for a day, went around Copenhagen, saw lots of very cool things, and just had a great time. So Denmark is going to be my pick.
Was that last week you were in Sweden?
Yes.
I was there last week. How did we miss each other?
I don't know. I was way down the south in Malmö and Lund in Sweden on Friday. Where were you on Friday?
I was in Stockholm.
Ah, awesome. So that's my pick is Copenhagen, Denmark, and by extension, Sweden. Had a great time in all those places. Fun place to go. Everybody speaks English. Super easy to go on vacation there. Loved it. And so, Patrick, you're up.
Yeah, so my pick is Angular 2. If you haven't already, go ahead and try it out. And Babel was my other pick. If you haven't already, you should write something with Babel.
Awesome. Okay, well, thank you so much for being on the show, Patrick. It was a really fun episode. I like these ones like this. It's great. And good information. I mean, Angular 2 is coming up. We need all this content as much as we can get in the hands of the people. So power to the people, right?
All right, yeah.
The people have a right to know. Yeah, I feel like I'm like a Nobel Pulitzer-winning journalist on the front lines of some war wearing a flak jacket.
Oh, yeah.
Yep, that's basically what I am.
Definitely.
Dude, it's such a noble calling.
Yes.
The podcast guy.
Yes. It is noble. It is so noble. We all deserve
nothing.
Adulation, acclamation.
We deserve nothing, bro.
Really, you're
Thanks,
fishing.
everybody.
You're fishing for compliments now. This is tough.
You're fishing.
Yeah. Anybody who agrees with me, tweet at one of us on the show today and let us know that you agree that this is a noble calling.
No. If you agree with me that we deserve nothing, then tweet that as well.
All right, tweet that. And if you agree with me that this is noble and we deserve adulation, tweet at me.
Totally.
# noble podcast.
Yep. And if you agree with Ward, then tweet that too. I want to hear that.
Yeah,
all right.
That'll be
Thanks.
3 people.
Thank you, everybody, for listening in, and we will see you all next week. Thanks, Patrick, again for coming. It's a great episode. Talk to everybody later.
Peace.
This episode is sponsored by Mad Glory. You've been building software for a long time, and sometimes it gets a little overwhelming. Work piles up, hiring sucks, and it's hard to get projects out the door. Check out Mad Glory. They're a small shop with experience shipping big products. They're smart, dedicated, will augment your team, and work as hard as you do. Find them online at madglory.com or on Twitter at madglory. Hosting and bandwidth provided by the Blue Box Group. Check them out at bluebox.net. Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CacheFly.com to learn more. Do you want to have conversations with the Adventures in Angular crew and their guests? Do you want to support the show? Now you can. Go to adventuresinangular.com/forum and sign up today.